Welcome back to The Bottom Line. I am joined today by Armin Hammer. Haven't had you on in a minute. How's everything
That's right.
going?
I'm doing great. It has been a very weird weather week here in
Ooh,
Austin. Like started off with over 100 degrees every day for like almost a week,
oh
all of
my.
last week. And then this week it's been weird and rainy,
Huh.
and it's very strange. It's a very, very strange world we live in right now.
Well, it's strange for a number of reasons. Obviously, the weather being one of them, 2020 being one of them, and then the CrossFit Games, which is about to kick off, is like another reason why things are kind of wacky and different and new and exciting. And the reason we're having you on today is to talk about just all the most recent information that we have found out that is starting to finally shape what the games is going to look like when they kick off in just about 2 weeks here. So take us through some of the latest info that we've gotten and how that is starting to shape the season.
Yeah, that drip feed of info from CrossFit HQ is really, I feel like a hamster trying to grab onto the big water jug, just taking any drop that I can. Recently we learned just a slight amount of information more than we knew before. We learned that the competition is going to be about 2 days, something like 48 hours. So Friday and Saturday, it's probably going to be a handful of events. We learned that the competition itself is going to be asynchronous. So the athletes have their own local time assigned blocks to do whatever the workouts are, and that the scoring is going to be blind until all the events are completed by each of those athletes. So, they wait until everyone across the world has done all of event one before publishing the scores, so that there's no way of the athletes going later in the day to have a leg up. And we also got the equipment list.
Hmm.
We got the official equipment list that was sent out to the athletes. And I don't know what you think about it, Nikki, but it seemed a little minimal. I'm going to use
Ooh.
the word minimal because that's probably how someone would use like a Zen description or a modern home, but minimal. As
Oh,
opposed to
oh.
bare, I'm going to say minimal.
Okay, that's kind of a nice way of putting it. I guess I didn't, it didn't necessarily hit me as minimal as much as it hit me as super accommodating, because I know that they had to reach out to the athletes and ask, who has access to what. We want to make sure that it is fair for everyone, or as fair as possible, as fair as you can make things in 2020 in this landscape that we know absolutely nothing about. But yeah, it felt to me like almost like the open, like making sure that everyone had everything that they needed. Tell me why you think it's bare though. Oh, sorry, not bare, minimal.
Minimal. Yeah,
Minimal.
minimal. Because I don't want to be like super critical. I don't want to be unfair in my analysis of this
Okay.
thing. I'm going to use the word minimal because it is missing a couple things that I would say are not just ubiquitous across every gym that every one of these athletes would have access to, but also very useful in testing what they're trying to test. I
Okay.
mean, just simply dumbbells, any pair of dumbbells, or a medicine ball for wall ball, or rings, or boxes, plyo boxes. I mean, these are all things that show up in the open. All these athletes have to have had access to it at some point in the past year.
Mm-hmm.
So, assuming that they still do CrossFit at a CrossFit facility or their own facility, they probably still have access to these things. And these are things that show up in the open over the past couple years very regularly that aren't on this list. So either they're saving some of this stuff for later on, the in-person finals, or they just feel like it's not a necessary part of a test to separate the top 5 from the top 30.
Yeah, that's kind of where my head was at. Like if wall balls or box jumps or some sort of variation of those types of pieces of equipment never showed up at all in the entire test of the CrossFit Games, I might be like, oh, that's interesting. Usually we have something along those lines. But we have to remember that this first 48-hour online window is in fact just a separator. And so I guess the counter argument would be, nowhere does it say that in the first section of the CrossFit Games that equipment necessarily shows up. So I
Sure.
get what you're saying, but I kind of not ready to be super critical until I see how the programming plays out.
Yeah. The thing that probably surprised me the most in terms of what's missing from that list, and I had multiple conversations with the athletes that are going to be participating in this thing. And across the board, it was hit and miss in terms of what people felt about it. And at that level, they kind of can't have really big feelings about it. It
Right.
just is what it is.
They're
It's the
going to
game
do
that
it.
they're
Yeah.
playing. They're going to do it regardless. But what surprised me specifically that I was missing is rope climbs. And
Okay.
I think that when you're looking at testing, even if you look at 2019, which you could probably make an argument that Dave Castro conceded a lot about his control over the CrossFit Games when it came to 2019, the very first event, the event that cut half of the field, had rope climbs and running and squat snatches.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I don't think any of these athletes would be lacking access to a rope to climb, because they sure as hell should be practicing that going into the CrossFit Games. And now that you're telling them essentially, hey, you know what? We're not going to test this tool that has been used at regionals and the games as a complete separator for the past 10 years. We're just not going to test it until the top 5 show up. That to me is probably the biggest missing link in all of this equipment.
Interesting. I'm very curious to learn, and I hope someday we learn what the mentality was going into this type of a programming. And I wonder if half the field were like, we just don't have rope. I mean, not likely, but if it was a factor like that, or if it's a factor of trying to figure out the best way to validate the height of the rope, and is that impossible? I mean, you'd think if they had access to, what is the wheelie thing that you use to like measure meters, and they need or a track or
I
something
think
along those
they're
lines.
required to have a measuring tape as well.
Right. So in my head, I'm like, I just wonder what was going through their minds when they chose or didn't choose pieces of movement, pieces of equipment, when you're right, like most of these top tier athletes, I would assume, still have access to a gym. I'm very curious to know how the mind of Dave Castro works.
It did include the GHD, which
Yep.
is fair. I think that's a more advanced tool. You're probably not going to be seeing that show up in the open because it's not as common. It's very big, it's bulky, it's not the most easy thing for a lot of gyms to equip more than 1 or 2 of them. So it makes sense that they're going to use it in a much more surgical test that this CrossFit Games has to be. But what does GHD add, other than GHD sit-ups? We've seen that at regionals, but if we're going to compare this type of event to how selective regionals was and how selective this event has to be, then it really, I think, shines light on what's missing. Things like rope climbs, weight vest, kettlebells, that every gym already has, and these athletes have access to in spades. Because just imagine, they already have to ask favors. If they don't own their own affiliate, they already have to ask a favor to be like, hey, I need you to shut down your gym for 2 days.
Right. Because I can't have anyone else with me. That was also one of the stipulations. They have to do it alone.
That completely slipped my mind. They're required to be completely alone with the judge while they're doing this event. And, I think since they already have to ask some favors, why not rely on the community a little bit more and just say, hey, you know what? Find a couple of local affiliates that will lend you this pair of kettlebells, this pair of dumbbells, and the ability to use their rope or whatever.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. There's also a part of me that wonders, we could say you're missing X, Y, and Z piece of equipment as until we're blue in the face, but it's only going to be two days of competition. There's only so much you can do with so many pieces of equipment that you can have in that period of time. So, but I do particularly like your point about the rope in terms of using it in the past as a separator, and honestly consistently seeing that some of the top tier athletes and some of the best athletes we've ever seen in the world have had that as a whole. It's interesting to not have that in there.
Yeah, the rope climb has a very specific place in CrossFit in its history as a competitive event, from Rich to Katrin to the legless rope climb finally making it to the games and being a really big separator, to seeing volume rope climbs at regionals for the first time. Like, I believe Tommy V is that workout. That's the thruster volume of rope climbs. Rope climbs have always been this really big separating event. And suddenly they're not being used when separation is the most important factor in this contest.
I wonder if they'll show up for the top 5. I wonder if that'll be like the hardest rope climb, legless with a vest, and then you gotta ninja your way up to the top somehow, and then you gotta come down only using your feet. Like we're gonna
Yeah.
see some next evolution of it, but only for the top 5. Maybe
It's
it'll be something like
legless.
that.
You're going to hear it here first, folks. It's legless rope climbs, but you don't touch with your hand. You touch with one of your feet.
That'll be it. That's gonna be the final new movement that we learn for the first time in games. I'm just sad that we won't have the chance to see people stealing each other's chalk at the bottom of the rope. That was always my favorite.
Huge bummer. Huge bummer.
Huge bummer. I do want to talk for a minute about this blind leaderboard, because I do think that a lot of times athletes need some sort of motivation or goal in the forefront, or they're using other people's scores or their own to game the system. Kind of like there's a lot at play when it comes to having an active leaderboard. Without that, how do you think it changes the landscape for these guys that are trying to, get into the top 5 and continue the competition?
I love the idea of a blind leaderboard. It's
Okay.
something that I've actually been trying to advocate for a while. I mean, I've mentioned
Really?
it a bunch of times on my channel. It's something that I think would make cheating in the open significantly harder. If the leaderboard was blind until submissions were closed, then suddenly you would be able to see who's cheating much easier, because they wouldn't just be able to make up a score
Hmm.
a couple reps ahead of where they need to be.
Interesting.
So I think the blind leaderboard brings a lot of interesting gamesmanship to a competition. It does make it a little bit more challenging for people like you and me to try
Yes.
and talk about what's happening, because unless we hear it directly from the athletes, or someone who's right next to them, or hears it directly from them, it's going to be very difficult for us to cover what's happening
Right.
in real time. So that does make it a little bit more challenging on the spectator portion of it. But imagine an event like Chaos, right? In Chaos, it essentially was a blind leaderboard. You had no idea when the event was going to finish, or who was going to be ahead of you, or whether you were going to be able to make up time on the next movement, because you had no idea what the next movement was. And Chaos is one of my favorite all-time CrossFit Games workouts.
Me too. What
So
a wild ride.
absolutely. I think that idea of the blind leaderboard in a situation like this just adds a little bit of a much more cerebral competition for the athletes. They have to be able to motivate themselves to go to a very, very high level of performance without any external news about how close their competitor is to them, how much cheering there is if they're getting near the finish line, how many people are calling their name, or any of that energy, external energy, much less the actual information about what types of scores they need to put up in order to advance.
So that brings up a question that I've thought about a little bit in the past. And I remember specifically thinking about this the year that everyone was flown to the ranch for the first time for the trail run. I think that the older athletes and the heritage athletes and the athletes with a little bit more experience in competition setting might rely a little bit less on the hype. I think that some of the newer athletes to CrossFit who have only been with us in this sort of like, big monstrous arena age, or the age of Instagram, or the age of YouTube, like those are the athletes that are a little bit more used to the fame and the fans and the yelling and screaming. And I just wonder if it will hit them a little bit differently, being alone in the gym doing this. And then for the top 5 that are out in Aromas eventually, like, not having crowds, not having fans, not having signs and noisemakers. Like it's just a very different experience that some of them have never had.
And absolutely, I 100% agree with you. And I think not only is that going to play a role in this online version, but it will absolutely play a role in the finals. Because in the finals, generally, even when they were flown to Aromas, I believe that was 2016, they were flown to Aromas. It was the last year they were doing it in California. Even that, you had the entire field with you.
Right.
It was you and 80 athletes, like 40 men, 40 women. You're the best in the world. You had someone to push up against and compete with. Whereas even the finals, the in-person finals, it's 5. And 5 is much more of an intimate, bro sesh than it is a competition with millions of dollars on the line. And it's going to be very interesting to see how those athletes adapt to that. And I think I think bringing up the Aromas, the 2016 Aromas trip is a really good comparison because I've heard from some of the athletes that competed there and excelled in that environment that they saw other athletes fall apart because they couldn't deal with not having control over simple things like where they were resting, what their food situation was like.
Totally,
And they
totally.
also couldn't deal with the fact that there wasn't a crowd. There wasn't a cheering section for them. They didn't have their support with them. They didn't have the loud music and
Mm-hmm.
the feel of the CrossFit Games. I think the quote, it's not a direct quote, but it's kind of, my remembering this quote is, the people forgot that they were at the CrossFit Games when you're just standing in the dust and Dave Castro says 3, 2, 1, go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think it's an experience that we all can share in to a certain extent. Like, that you could do burpees and air squats and whatever in your backyard, and you could get a workout in by yourself at the gym if you had to, but it's never the same when you're not in a class, when you're not with your friends, when your jam doesn't come on the radio. Like, it's human nature. And I think that the real CrossFit Games athletes that excel in any situation with any piece of equipment or any whatever, they're like snipers. Like, they just don't need any of that stuff. And it totally separates the field. It totally, they're the ones that can go to a dark place, that can train in silence, that can whatever. And a lot of us just can't. A lot of us just aren't that solid.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I think the real killers in there are definitely looking forward to being alone in the pain cave because they know that's an advantage for them and it's a weakness for a lot of other people.
Totally, totally. So what's the bottom line for you at this point in time? Now that we've gotten this drip of information, we're a little bit closer to understanding how the games is going to kick off in 2 weeks. What does the landscape look like for you?
It is honestly, this little bit of information is still not enough to make any sort of estimate on how things are going to go or really what to expect from the athlete's perspective, from our perspective, from the spectator's perspective. I think there's just still so little known. That is kind of CrossFit's MO, the whole like unknown and unknowable CrossFit
Yep.
Games thing. And I
Totally,
get it.
totally, totally.
Part of that is I think they're trying to really keep the athletes on their toes and make sure that there is as much surprise and as much adversity for them to deal with as possible. I think part of that is also, honestly, they're still trying to figure it out. They're just
Yeah.
not releasing the information because they don't necessarily have hard and fast answers for things.
Yeah.
And that's fair. This is not a simple undertaking. And I'm, I could come across sometimes on my content as being, the very critical, very outspoken, very like, wag my finger at CrossFit not necessarily doing things correctly, quote unquote. But what I'm trying to get across is that this is not an easy thing that they're trying to
No.
do. And I'm very impressed that they've gotten this far.
Same.
So,
Yeah.
my confidence in them to pull off an event has only grown in the past couple months.
Same. I do think that there's a lot that they're probably, still pulling as far as levers go behind the scenes to figure out how they can even get this whole thing to happen. Because realistically, and I feel like I say this at the end of every bottom line as we sort of evaluate what's going on with games this season, but realistically, something bad could happen in California tomorrow and they have to pull the plug and it has nothing to do with their planning or with HQ at all. And it's just local government or the pandemic or something else. I don't know. It's 2020. Lava flow. Why not throw it out like
So,
something new?
yeah.
You know what I mean? So there's definitely still a lot to be learned, but there's unfortunately a lot that is not dictated by HQ itself.
Very true.
Well, I am still excited to see what other things come down the pipeline here as they continue to release information. And the games kicks off in just about 2 weeks. So Armin, thank you so much for evaluating the current landscape with me on the bottom line. And we will see you guys next time.